We're now going to move into a session where we're going to actually hear from the head of the Center for Drugs at FDA on how the voice of the patient can and has impacted drug development and drug approvals. We have with us Dr. Janet Woodcock. She's the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. She also, you heard mention of the Office of New Drugs. She has also stepped into that position as acting director. This is the office within CDER that has the responsibility for reviewing and approving all new drug applications. And to lead us in a conversation with Dr. Woodcock, we have Deborah Lappin, who is a principal at Fager BD Consulting, where she leads the Health and Biosciences team. She's also a leader in patient advocacy and herself is an individual with an autoimmune disease. So Deborah, Dr. Woodcock.
It's an honor to get to have a conversation with you today, Dr. Woodcock.
Thank you.
I'd like to keep it casual and personal, as much as you're comfortable with. This is an audience that especially appreciates all you do. We heard about your work at the FDA. Dr. Woodcock's been there over 3 decades and has led and is recognized, you are recognized as a champion for the patient's voice, the patient experience, and how it will be moved into drug development. You are also a rheumatologist, and that for this audience is probably one of the most important parts of your resume. How does being a rheumatologist affect your view of the patient experience?
Well, I haven't taken care of patients in quite some time, but when I did, of course, people with autoimmune diseases, people treated by rheumatologists are young people, many of them, people of all ages. They suffer from very serious conditions. They have few treatment options. Those options are pretty unsatisfactory. And so I think that shapes my understanding of where people are in looking for treatment options for that set of circumstances, okay? People who are facing serious diseases, but the treatment options are also serious, and it's a very life-disrupting chronic disease where people must go on. I really applaud all of you for being here today and willing to give your time to this effort. I think it's very important because where you stand on issues is really where we stand. My belief is that we work for you, that's who we work for. I've always believed that.
And we have over 300 in the audience today, so you know, and over 350 watching online.
Wow, that's impressive. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted you to know that since you didn't hear it earlier. We just heard from Pajita a discussion of how the input that will be received today will be used at the FDA. We'd like to hear from you. What difference will today's meeting make in the way that you, Janet Woodcock, no drug in this country gets out of the FDA without Janet's final signature? How will what is given to you from today's experience have an effect on how you review drugs that may treat lupus?
Well, let's talk about some of the meetings we've already had that have had an effect. We've heard from people with serious diseases already, I think, or diseases where the medical community might not think they're so serious, and we've heard about the impact on people's lives and how much suffering they undergo. And in those cases, this has changed our approach to drug development in those diseases.
How has it changed it?
Well, I think we're more open to, for serious parts of the disease, to having more open to more uncertainty, more open to a certain amount of risk, okay? Because we recognize what people face, also risks.
So that I want to say with for a moment. You have championed, beginning in 2000, a benefit risk framework. And in that framework, you try to say, look at what is the context in which a drug is being brought to the patient. And further, you've championed this notion of understanding benefit versus risk. How do you look at the risk that a drug presents and compare it to the risk that the people listening today face in their daily battle with lupus?
Well, FDA has to make one decision, and it's like at a population level. And so we have to decide for people with the condition, with the indication for the drug, overall for all those people, are the benefits going to outweigh the harms, right? But that's just the first part of our job. The second part of our job is to enable that individual decision-making between the healthcare provider and the patient, to provide the patient with that autonomy, right? So that people who have the disease understand not only what risks or harms are they facing, you know, how much inconvenience and effect on their lives is this going to have? You know, is this an infusion? Is it a pill? You know, what kind of side effects will you expect? Common and debilitating as well as serious and potentially life-threatening. And so part of our job is to enable autonomy for you who are facing the disease and also facing the consequences of treatment, have enough information that you can make your own decisions. So we have a two-level kind of job. First, we have to decide there's benefit there, and is kind of the juice worth the squeeze? You know, is the amount of benefit going to be worth it to exposing the people to this drug? But second of all, we have to provide information so people can make their own individual decisions. And one of the most important things about these meetings is we need to get a feel of the impact on people's lives, the burden of disease, as well as the burden of current treatments. Because that's the context we're talking about when you're talking about introducing a new therapy.
I just want to know what I know everybody is thinking. The fact that you use the word autonomy for an individual who knows the risk they face and have experienced it with lupus, to weigh that risk against will they take a new medication that of course presents risk. Life is not without risk.
That's right.
But this is an audience that knows risk.
Yes, yes.
Now what about endpoints? We also heard Pajita bring this up. For this audience, you're going to hear from the record what matters most to them. Kathleen mentioned the immense debilitating fatigue that comes with this disease.
Understand.
Totally disabling.
Right.
Can't think, can't act, can't do. How do you take an endpoint like fatigue and assure that a drug developer in this audience is going to be able to have the tools it needs to show that its therapy can arrest fatigue?
Right. Well, you know, there's been quite a debate about this, for example, in the rheumatoid arthritis area, where they have very effective therapies, okay? And we do know to a great extent that fatigue is driven by underlying inflammation. That's what, you know, part of a lot of what causes the fatigue to happen, right? And so, like, if you could shut down the inflammation, can you then shut down fatigue? And maybe you don't have to measure it, right? Why? Because measuring fatigue is very hard, and there have been ongoing efforts to do scales for rheumatoid arthritis, and there are other efforts to do fatigue scales for other autoimmune diseases. Because it is important to people, and that's one of the things I want to know, like how, even if it's hard to measure, people want to know, I take the risk of taking this drug, right? How likely is it my fatigue will abate and I'll be able to do more things I want to do, participate more in my life, right? And so that's information that's important to patients. So one of the issues, as Pajita said, is we need instruments in each disease, and we call them instruments. It's kind of a technical term, but what we mean is questionnaires and so forth that have been proven to be able to measure fatigue accurately and measure if fatigue goes down, then you could be sure it did go down, right? And you can then put that in the drug label and people will know. But that's what people want to know. If I take this drug, the symptoms I'm suffering from the worst, how much impact would it likely have on these symptoms? And of course, fatigue is one of them.
Last year, you issued a groundbreaking decision to approve a drug in a rare disease, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And many have said that the process you went through was tough going, controversial. You were under the microscope, and it was not meant for anyone who would shrink under pressure. Dr. Califf, in fact, said that the emergence of patient-centered drug development and extensive interactions with the patient community were part of the overall environment for our development and decision-making. While methods for patient-centered drug development are evolving, the fact that this disease involved vulnerable people, life-threatening illness, understandably concerned parents produced significant pressures on everyone involved. Then he noted that your leadership enjoys broad public support, largely due to the healthy atmosphere of transparency and debate that characterize this appeal, and that your record reveals courage in the face of extreme pressure from Congress, press, patient and patient advocacy groups, and industry, and that you have taken and supported unpopular decisions when appropriate, and you're well known for not relenting to pressure. Wow. Tell us about that experience, and tell us how it is meaningful to the work that will be undertaken in this meeting. How can we learn from it, and what did you learn from it?
Well, that was very kind of Dr. Califf to say those things about me. I have had to deal with lots of controversies in my career, including ones where there are differences of opinion within the agency, where this was one of those. Of course, it was very controversial, whether to grant accelerated approval for that drug. Now, that was for a rare subset of an already rare disease, okay? And it was a targeted therapy. And so there was a great deal of debate about what the threshold for demonstrating the effect of the drug should be. And it wasn't a clinical effect, it was a biochemical effect on the missing protein, all right? So we had it out, and I actually made that decision, and that's very well known. I think what we learned is we need to, the point, and I made this point in my memo, I think Rob Califf made it in his memo, was we need better drug development. Okay, if you have good drug development or good enough drug development, then you're not going to have these controversies. And so just exposing some patients and hoping you'll get a home run is not a good drug development strategy. And so hopefully the patient community can become, as part of these activities, more aware, okay, of what proper drug development is like, why we do it, okay? One of the reasons you do drug development is to gather information to give to patients. So you know, does this drug work? Should I take it? I mean, there's no free lunch with drugs. They're all going to have some side effects. And so you really want to know that they work, and you want to know how much they work. And ideally, you'd find what symptoms they most work on so that people can make those individual decisions.
So that particular case, the drug was given what we call accelerated approval, so that it could get into patients' lives. And then what would you hope to be learning because of the accelerated approval? Tell us what the standard was,
right,
and then what you hope to learn now that it's inpatient
certainly
treatment.
So Duchenne muscular dystrophy is due to a genetic defect that's hereditary, and it's passed down to boys through the mother, more or less, because it's on the X chromosome. And their drugs, the current treatment paradigm is to try to replace that protein somehow. And this treatment that was approved under accelerated approval, its mission was to try to sort of trick your DNA into making the protein anyway, even though, you know, it wasn't making the protein, to interact right at the DNA RNA level and trick the protein into, trick the nucleic acid into making the missing protein. Now, nobody disagreed that that wouldn't be a great thing to do. The issue was what level of protein had to be produced. That was the argument. How much of normal was needed in order to make a clinical benefit, okay? Now this particular drug that was approved under accelerated approval had very few side effects, although it has to be given intravenously, and so there's some risks with that. So on the harm side, it appeared very low. But it produced only a small amount of the protein, but it was clear that it did trick the people's nucleic acid into making this protein. Mm-hmm. And so that accelerated approval, we said, okay, we'll approve it, and you're going to have to show afterward that the children do better. And so the firm is doing different randomized trials to look at that.
Well, I think for this audience, the point is you move the drug as far down the approval pipeline as the science would allow you to do, right. And it was bold. So coming back to our job, how do we make, in your view, the most out of the next 6 hours that we have here today? How do we give you the information you need to carry what the voices of the people with lupus will be telling you, and to then connect it to accelerating drug development in lupus? Talk about that bridge and give us our marching orders.
Well, I think what we would like to hear from this community is, what is the burden of disease to you? And we already started hearing about that. There aren't just the sicknesses, okay, the renal problems, the skin problems, the joint problems. We know. Tell us about those, but also about the fatigue, about the burden, about the impact on your daily lives, what you can't do, okay? How debilitating is this to the whole person, not just to the medical person, okay? Because we don't, I'll tell you, one of our clinicians at the Center for Drugs sat through one of these, and I won't say which one, but she was in that field. She was a subspecialist. And what she said at the end, she said, I've sat across the table from patients for 20 years and listened, and she said, I never knew.
Never knew.
I never knew. So she walked away, even though she was a subspecialist, she walked away from that patient-focused drug development meeting with a new understanding of what the suffering that people with that disease have every day, and the impact on their overall lives, not just their numbers in the chart. And I think that's what's important. You know, the medical paradigm tends to focus on the numbers, they focus on survival, they focus on a few amount of things. But really what's important to us, really we're supposed to alleviate suffering, okay? Not alleviate numbers on a chart. Those in some ways are surrogates for what really matters, which is how well you live, if you can live your life fully, not impeded by this disease. So we need to know all the dimensions. That doesn't mean tomorrow we're going to be able to study them all, but we need to know which ones are the most important. Second, I think we need to know what's the burden of treatment. And I think someday we have folks from FDA here today, and I think they're quite good, and they will listen. But I have heard people at FDA say, oh, you know, going in having infusions, it's not so bad, even if you have an infusion reaction or whatever. And I'm there, I don't think so. I mean, I think if I had to do that, I mean, the alternative, not getting treated, is worse, right? But that's a burden. That's a burden of treatment. The side effects you have are a burden of treatment. Maybe eye exams you have to go to. It all takes away from your life, right? So we want to hear about two, not just the burden of disease, what are the burdens of treatment? And then three, what about the clinical trials? How tolerable are they? You know, we always have a lot of trouble with dropouts, okay, in trials. And one of the reasons is the trials are made kind of for the numbers, so we can get all the numbers and everything. But if the people won't go to the visits because they're onerous, or they're too long, or they're scheduled too frequently together, or whatever part of them. We've had ones where young children are asked to come and they have to be at like the hospital all day, all right? This is in other diseases, and have to undergo all kind of tests like all day, like repeatedly, week after week. People aren't going to do that. So we need to know, and I think drug companies need to have your input to design trials that actually will work for you so that you can participate in the trials. Are there different remote ways of getting some of the information? Are there ways that the burden of the trial can be diminished so that we have full participation? So those are some of the things that we'd really like to know. And we understand that the disease is heterogeneous. And what do I mean by that? Well, people sitting around a table, each of you may have different problem with lupus. And that, it makes it hard for lupus to study. And that's been one of the reasons we've had difficulty getting endpoints and actually getting results out of trials and so forth, because people may have so many different symptoms, and to measure all of them and then, you know, to put them all together and so forth can be very difficult. And so composite endpoints have been made and scales have been made and so forth. But it is lupus has been a very frustrating disease for drug developers, and I think for the community as well, in that we really haven't made breakthroughs like we have in some other areas, and it really is time.
Well, we're ready to help you be sure those breakthroughs come to everyone in this audience and everyone listening. We had a number of other areas we could be discussing, your leadership of different kinds of clinical trial models to make the trials more efficient, whether lupus is accurately described in today's criteria. Dr. Lipsky in the audience reminded me that 4 academic medical centers say 200,000 people meet the current criteria description for lupus, so I want to plant those as other seeds we might have discussed. But I do want to end, our time is up, and just on behalf of everybody, thank you, Janet Woodcock, for your leadership at the FDA.
Most welcome. Thank you all.